I'm going to start presenting one of the speakers, who is Kirsten Hesse. She is a registered nurse and assistant professor in the School of Nursing at UBC in Vancouver, in Canada. Her research program is focused on understanding the experience of older adults and how they manage their cancer, chronic disease, and well-being. The goal of her program of research is to engage older adults with lived experiences of cancer and chronic disease to co-lead the development of community-based interventions to improve quality of life and well-being among older adults and their caregivers. So it is a pleasure to present Kirsten.
Okay, good evening from me too. I would like to thank you all for your participation and your time, and of course our speakers for their presentation. It's our pleasure to co-chair this webinar of Nightingale Challenge. My name is Konstantina Glogoni. I am advanced nurse practitioner from Cyprus. I have done an MSc in oncology nursing, and I'm doing my PhD with Dr. Haralambous Andreas on the topic of cancer-related cachexia prevention. I am a young cancer nurse representative of EONS for my country, and I'm working as a teaching assistant of nursing department at Cyprus University of Technology. Finally, I'm working as a research nurse at the Radiation Oncology Department of German Oncology Center. Now, I would like to introduce you one of our speakers, which is Dr. Amanda Drury. She's an assistant professor in nursing at the School of Nursing, Midwifery and Health Systems of University College at Dublin. She is a Fulbright HRB Health Impact Scholar to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center of New York from 2020 to 2021. Dr. Amanda is a registered nurse and holds an MSc and a PhD in cancer care. Her research interests span the areas of supportive and palliative care in cancer. She is also currently a board member of European Oncology Nursing Society, a chair of the EONS Young Cancer Nurses Network, and the co-chair of the EONS Research Working Group. So we can hand over to our speakers, but before I would like to tell you that don't hesitate to text your questions for the end, for the Q&A through our chat, and me and Laura we will manage the questions. Okay, let's begin.
Thank you, Konstantina and Laura, and hello to everybody and welcome. And thank you also to Kirsten Haas, who is co-presenting with me this evening. So we're going to treat this session very much as tips and tricks in how to succeed in your career in cancer nursing. So we have prepared a slideshow, but it's very much, as I said, tips and tricks. So I suppose to start off, Kristen and I are currently collaborators on two-ish systematic reviews. We've recently finished publishing our first paper together. So as you gathered from our introduction, we're assistant professors in nursing, but I'm based in Ireland and Kristen's based in Canada. So I suppose the first question people might have is, how did we meet? We're very far apart. So I suppose this is a big part of what we'll talk about this evening, is how you build your networks. And I suppose we met in 2018 during an early career researchers workshop in Canada and the University of Toronto, the Huffman Splain Emerging Nurse Scholars Forum. So this was a workshop for early career nurse researchers, nurse scientists and nurse scholars from around the world. It wasn't specific to cancer care. And on the first morning, I think I walked in and sat down beside Kristen and started chatting. So I suppose you think in a room of about 35 participants, the odds of two people from nursing backgrounds with a special interest in cancer care sitting beside each other in this kind of a setting is unusual. So we went through our initial niceties, the hello, the introduction, where we're from, what our interests are, and kind of identifying very quickly that we had common interests in research and in clinical practice. And it took me about 3 hours to realize that Kristen and I already had connected in a virtual manner. We had already been following each other on Twitter for several months. So I suppose there's a thing to think about, and particularly in these COVID times, is that networking is not just the in-person networking, because I think that is something that's going to be extremely difficult for the foreseeable future. So it's thinking and being a little bit more innovative and forward thinking in how you can virtually connect with people that you have interest in connecting with. But Kristen, I don't know, is there anything you would like to add? I suppose you might have had a very different perspective of our first meeting.
No, I think that was my view as well, that we were both very, very pragmatic about, okay, you're really nice and I'm really nice, and hey, maybe we could work together. But I think, what we want to talk about today is also, we want to emphasize that we're not experts in developing a research career. We're novices. And so I think we really want to share our experiences with you, and know that they might be different from yours, particularly if you're just sort of entering graduate studies or thinking about it now during the pandemic. Things are a little bit different. So we'll try to lend some insight into that. But certainly please remember that we are emerging nurse researchers, so we'll try to offer you the best we can. And please, in the chat, feel free to ask questions, interrupt us if you have a question. We want this to be a dialogue. So yeah.
Great. So as I said, we're going to structure this as a conversation around our top tips and tricks. And as Kristen has said, we're coming at this very much from early career researchers' perspectives. I completed my PhD 2 years ago, and Kristen, if I'm correct, you finished about 3.5 years?
No, I was 2018 as well.
Okay,
yes.
My apologies. I, for some reason, always think of you as being a little bit further ahead than me. So I have only just joined my first lecturing or faculty post, which incorporates both teaching and research. And Kristen has, since September 2018, she had her first faculty post in the University of Saskatchewan. And as you heard, has started in the University of British Columbia just in July this year, if I'm correct. So we're talking about today about our top tips and tricks. And I suppose to give you that overview, we'll be talking about how you set goals, building your network, looking for opportunities, taking those risks, accepting rejection because it is an inherent part of academia and research, and then also finding balance and taking rest when needed. So to start off, and we also, through all of these, we'll talk about the importance of mentorship to navigate all of these specific tips and tricks. So Kristen is going to start us off with her experience of setting goals and planning ahead.
Thank you. And I did see the comment about slowing down, so we will try to be mindful of that as well. So the first thing that we'll touch on, which I think is very important, is setting goals. And there's a quote here that says, if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. So it's really important. I think we could change slides, Amanda.
Oh, apologies.
That's okay. It's really important to think about what your goals are. And really, it depends on your career stage. So if you are just thinking about starting a master's degree, your goal might be to finish your master's degree and to think about how you can incorporate research into your clinical practice. Perhaps you're doing a PhD and your ultimate goal is to develop a research career. So your goals will look different. But a metric that someone once told me that is very useful is to think about both activity and outputs. When you're thinking about meeting a goal, these two things together can be very helpful. So the activity is the things that you do, the actions that you take to show people that you're active. So these things might be collaborations, conferences, developing relationships, perhaps joining national and international committees like EONS. Those would be the activities. And then the output is really the concrete evidence of that activity. So for example, an output for Amanda would be, an output of her international networking would be taking part in this webinar. Or for me, an output might be, as well, putting this on my CV, or an output of my collaboration with Amanda would be the fact that we published a paper together. We've submitted a grant together. So the outputs are really showing people that, yes, you know, you have this goal, but you're working toward it with the use of both the engagement in these activities and the outputs that come from them. Do we have another slide with this one?
No, we're on to networks next.
Okay, so in terms of goals, I think you really have to think about setting goals that are relevant to you and what you're trying to achieve. And those goals change often. So, you know, once you achieve the goal that you've already set, you will set a new goal, and you might want to have a 5-year goal that you keep revisiting. The 5-year plan is often referenced in academia, how you work toward that every year you're working towards that 5-year goal. And obviously it gets further and further away every time you look at it. So trying to think about goals that are really measurable. We all know about sort of that SMART metric. Measurable and practical and actually reachable goals are really important. And the other thing, I actually just read something yesterday that said rejection is redirection. And so I think that in the context of goal setting, that can be really important. If you set a goal that wasn't realistic, not being able to meet that goal might mean that it wasn't the right goal for you. So if you have a paper that's rejected, maybe it means that the paper wasn't strong, you hadn't attended to some of the serious issues, so you need to redirect your attention to that. Or perhaps you tried to achieve, you applied for an award and you didn't get it. Maybe it's because you need to redirect your attention to something else. So I think constantly thinking about what those goals are can be very helpful for your career. And setting goals with mentors and with people who you trust is really important. I don't make many decisions about my career without consulting one of my mentors, whether it's sort of like a peer mentor like Amanda, or you know, a senior mentor who has mentored me during different parts of my career. I will almost always bounce my goals off of someone else. Might be my boss at my job, but someone always has a hand in helping me to identify that those goals are appropriate. I think that's good for me for goals. Do you want to add anything, Amanda?
I suppose the only thing I would say is in planning sort of your activity and your outputs and setting those goals, one thing I always like to think about is what's your why? Why do you want to do this? And really any goal you have, there should be a semblance of a long-term plan. So as Kristen said, the 5-year plan is always a good trajectory. You can kind of map out where would you like to be in 5 years. And I think exactly as Kristen has mentioned, speaking to a mentor, identifying the things you need to do to get to that point. And perhaps you'll have a mix of your short-term goals, your medium-term goals, and the long-term goals that can get you there. And it's having that, I don't know if this is an international thing or an Irish thing, but particularly when you're entering a master's for the first time, I think nurses can be quite obsessed with Gantt charts. I think it is an international concept, but I suppose it's never any harm to have a Gantt chart for your career. And what that is essentially mapping out on sort of an annual or quarterly basis the next 5 years, the things you'd like to achieve. And I suppose constantly, as Kristen had suggested, coming back to that, looking back on it, reflecting on what you've done, because I think that's a really important part, is thinking about what you've done, what's gone well, what's not gone so well. And I think as we progress in this talk and we talk about failure, and Kristen has already talked about that a little bit, is, you know, looking at feedback. And I think your personal feedback to yourself when you've had a chance to sort of step back from a disappointment or something that hasn't gone well, you're able to more critically take a look at what happened and what you might be able to do different if an opportunity like that comes up in future. So I don't know, would you agree with that, Kristen, or anything else to add?
Yeah, it might be nice if we could, maybe when I do my next slide, Amanda, if you have a sample Gantt chart, or a link on making one, or if anyone on the call knows you and has one that we could paste into the chat, that might be That might be a good tool. Sorry to
If
put you on the
someone in the
spot.
chat might be able to paste in, because I'm working off a couple of different screens at the moment and I'm not confident I can find it, but I will try before the end of the call, maybe while we're doing the Q&A. So I'll move on to our next slide, which is about networking. And I suppose when I think about networking, you have to think of it as building a house. And again, this links nicely into the 5-year plan. You have to start with the foundations. And I think for young cancer nurses and early career nurses in particular, your networks start with your local connections. So it's building connections within your hospital, within your university, and it's identifying people with common interests that you'd like to work with going forward in your research, and sort of building on that over time. So I suppose I've put together, we have a slide here that where we'll each have an opportunity to talk about it. But I suppose if I reflect upon how I've developed my network, I very much focused in on sort of my local regional networks. And to do a research project, I think it's really important to have connections with your clinical partners, the people who are working in the hospital, particularly if you're not in a position to be working clinically during your research, because your clinical partners are ultimately the gatekeepers to your participants. They are the people that keep your research relevant. You know, if you're not working in clinical practice, things change quickly, and having those connections and conversations with the people you trust who are working in those settings can really help you along. And for me, my clinical collaborators are essential to the research I do. And they're the people who keep it relevant for both for clinicians, but then our patient research partners as well, keeping it relevant to the people who will benefit from the outputs of our research. So starting off, it's linking in with people in your hospitals, linking in with people in your local universities. But beyond that, when we're in a face-to-face circumstances and not in a pandemic, when you have the opportunity to attend events and starting to build your network. And I think we can have a tendency to be a little bit shy and think, oh, that person's very important and they don't want to talk to me. But I think you'd be very surprised when you put yourself out there that how willing people are to chat to you, hear about your research, you know, look for opportunities to collaborate in the future. And what I would say for someone coming in as an early career researcher, having an elevator pitch for those scenarios is really, really helpful. Being able to go in, say who I am, what it is I'm doing at the moment, and if there was, you know, finding that connection, because it's making the connection that's the important part. What is it that has drawn you to this person? Is it something that they said in their talk? Is it something about their methodology or their subject that's really interesting to you and you think that there might be future opportunities for collaboration? So I think that's a really good way to start. And I think having that elevator pitch can sometimes dispel some of the nerves that come from going up to someone who's speaking at a conference and help you along. And I suppose that's certainly something that's helped me along the way. I think it's really important when you do make those connections at conferences is to follow up on your conference contacts with an email. Say, it was really nice to meet you. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to connect again. And if opportunities come for you in the future to pursue funding or write a paper, that you might have the opportunity to connect with that person and ask them if they'd be interested in formally collaborating. I think in our virtual environment, then we're working in very different times, but I think things like Twitter, LinkedIn, and social media are good ways to sort of break the ice and start to connect to people. And I think it's made many sort of, I think, particularly high profile academics and experts in your field more approachable in some ways for those that are on social media. So it's kind of finding threads, replying, liking, you know, if you see that there's opportunities to connect on something that's of mutual interest, I think don't be afraid to comment on the thread, talk about your mutual interest, perhaps follow up in an email in the future where you feel it's appropriate. So it's, again, coming back to having that elevator pitch when you're writing those emails. It's really important to be very clear in what you're asking from the person, because emails, unfortunately, particularly if you're emailing a professor in cancer care, they could have several hundred emails in their inbox. So it's important to be very clear in who you are, what you're doing, and what you're asking of them, and making sure that it's a reasonable ask. So Kristen, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I would only add that I think chemistry is really important. So, you know, you might meet this big fancy Dr. Amanda Drury at a conference and automatically just think, oh, she's so amazing. And then you might meet me and think, oh, what is she talking about? You know, I don't understand. Chemistry is really important when you think about future collaborations. I think that those initial reactions that we have with those initial connections that we have with people are really important. And you'll see if someone responds to your email right away, that tells you something. Is this the same as someone not replying to your email, or someone taking weeks and weeks to reply to your email? So there are a couple little kind of indicators that you can look for when you're thinking about collaborators. But chemistry, I think, really is important. It is like, you know, it's like dating, blind dates, first dates. You know, what works, what doesn't work. You know, maybe you make a really bad first impression, you can probably come back from it. I think networking has a lot to do with your personality. And I think particularly for people who are maybe a little bit more shy or reserved, tools like social media, Twitter can be really helpful, because you can spend a lot of time thinking about what you want to say and say it rather than in person. And I would say personally, the first conferences that I attended as a young researcher when I was doing my master's, I found it very challenging and very isolating. There were all these groups of people who seemed to know each other, and I didn't know where I fit. I didn't know where I connected. So you do have to kind of put yourself out there. And attending conferences by yourself is probably the number one tip I can give you. If you attend a conference by yourself, you'll be forced to sit down next to someone you don't know, and you'll be forced to have a conversation with them. So when we attend conferences and you know, groups and things with our friends, it's really great. It's very comfortable, but it doesn't really push us out of our comfort zone. And I think Amanda's going to talk a little bit about taking risks, but I think that is an important feature, is really sort of that chemistry piece, and then also putting yourself out there. I could keep talking, but I will stop.
No, I entirely agree. And I suppose this is the nice thing of making this a conversation, is that things that I don't think of, and I think as I listen to you talk, I think of more things. So we could be here for a very long time if we were let. So I hope Laura and Constantina will keep us on time. But I suppose just to kind of a few concluding thoughts on networks, because I know one of the biggest issues that our young cancer nurses identify is having the time and the money to attend conferences, where often so many of these networks are built. So I suppose if I think of my own experience of this, in some cases there's a little bit of self-sacrifice needed, and particularly at the start. And I suppose thinking of it as an investment in yourself, and you'll hear me talking about your investment in yourself again in a moment. But I think at the early stage of your career, you have to look hard for kind of opportunities for small bursaries of funding to attend conferences. And often organizations like the European Oncology Nursing Society might have small bursaries, and they're usually advertised to attend the conference. Your national societies might have them, but even the organizations that are employing you might have small amounts of money that can support you. So they may not cover the complete costs, but even if the cost of the conference is covered, sometimes the cost of travel, particularly for local conferences, might not be so much or so difficult. So I suppose it's always looking for these small opportunities, and I think looking for small investments in research as well and building on those. I think the small investments ultimately you can leverage in the longer term to look for bigger sources of funding, bigger grants and things like that. So it's all about showing your upward trajectory, building your networks, building your grants, and showing it's all coming to those outputs. So Kristen, before I move off this slide, is there anything else you'd like to add? No. So then taking risks, and I suppose I never really thought about taking risks, and I think Christian proposed this slide, but I didn't think of it as taking risks until relatively recently. And I suppose as I've reflected on my last 12 years in nursing, it's very much been a series of taking risks without realizing it. I suppose I'm going to talk very much from a personal perspective here, and I suppose I'd love to hear questions if people want to know more, but I graduated as a nurse in 2008, so right into the middle of a global recession, and started into a very much temporary job in an area that interested me, but it wasn't my first love or passion. I knew where I wanted to be was in cancer. I had been lucky to work as a healthcare assistant for many, many years, and I had had the opportunity to sort of develop a sense of cancer care and where I wanted to, that was where I wanted to be. Apologies, I'm just going to take my phone off the hook because it's ringing. So I wanted to develop a career in cancer survivorship research agenda, and I support service development and improvement in Ireland. And I spent 5 years working clinically for the same organisation, but across different units. And I knew that my ultimate goal was to start to develop the cancer survivorship research agenda and start to support service development and improvement in cancer survivorship services in Ireland, because this was a big gap, particularly in the early 2010s in Ireland. But working as a junior nurse, and I think this is something that many young cancer nurses might identify with, is that, you know, I'm too young, I'm too inexperienced to make big changes. And I knew that the opportunities I needed to make those changes and influence practice in the way I wanted to required me to have more advanced credentials and senior roles. So until relatively recently, I think 2015, we'd had a moratorium on public service recruitment in Ireland. So we'd have the opportunity to recruit some staff nurses at a junior level, but recruitment at masters and at management and specialist and advanced practice level in Ireland was quite slow and to some extent non-existent in many parts of the country. So I was looking for alternative opportunities. If I couldn't manage or lead, how could I do it from the role I was in? And fortunately for me, one of our managers was offered another position in another organisation and left. And unfortunately for the unit, she wasn't replaced. But we were coming up to a point where we were about to undergo national audit, and our managers knew I had a really strong interest in research, that I was undertaking my master's, and they asked me if I would take on sort of responsibility for developing our practice and policy guidelines around chemotherapy administration and safety. So I had 10 policies to develop in a 6-week period, and I knew this was going to be a big ask. I wasn't going to get the job title that reflected what I was doing, and I wasn't going to get the pay that reflected what I was doing. But there was a little bit of pragmatism needed from me in deciding that, okay, this is an opportunity for me to develop these skills, and perhaps I'm not getting the recognition I'd like or that I want, but I will be able to go into a job interview when those jobs come available and say, I've been able to do this, look what I've done in this area. So I took that on, and I took that into my PhD. So this is where pragmatism becomes really, really important. It's really important to never stop learning the whole way through your career. And sometimes education is a risk. And I know this particularly for some of our colleagues in countries where master's level and PhD level education might not be a viable option to them. It's looking for opportunities outside of your comfort zone. So my PhD was the event that almost wasn't. I was in a job where I was earning about 40,000 euros per year, and I was offered a full-time PhD with an annual stipend of 6,500 euros per year. So my take-home pay was about 670 euro each month. That didn't even cover my rent. So I had to have a very serious conversation with my partner at the time and my husband now. And I suppose his point on the matter was, I've been talking about doing this for 3 years, pursuing my PhD. It was something I was really passionate about. And his advice was, you either stop talking about it or you do it. you have to go after it if you want, but you can't spend the rest of your life saying, what if? I suppose since then I've reconceptualized this leap. I took out a loan. I signed up to work agency. I worked around the clock about 6 to 7 days a week in order to keep myself financially secure. But in the longer term, I've looked at that very much as an investment in myself. And since then, I have funded my own master's in education. And again, I come back to all of this is investment in myself and my personal and professional development, and using those investments to leverage promotions and opportunities in other ways, whether it be in my research role or my teaching role, or even within my wider roles within the European Oncology Nursing Society and other networks that I'm involved in. So think of it as, I think the takeaway is you have to take a leap of faith, but you also have to see it as investing in yourself and taking a bet on yourself and your future. So Kristen, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add there. I've rambled a lot, I think.
No, that was great. I think the only thing I might add is that it is important to think about when you get invited into opportunities, opportunities beget opportunities. So, you do one thing, people see that you did a good job, you'll get asked to do more and more things. You'll get invited into more arenas. We'll talk about opportunities shortly. So all I would say is when you're thinking about taking a risk, consider how that helps you to meet your goal. So if we always have those goals in mind, Amanda's goal was to be an independent researcher. Taking the risk of doing her PhD was obviously a huge financial challenge for her, which is something we don't often talk about, but is actually really important, especially as nurses, where in a lot of countries, having a job as a nurse is actually a very good job and you're making good money, and then you're being told to go back to school and make very little money. So I think it's important to think where those risks lead you and if they help you to meet your goal or if they kind of take you on a different path. And sometimes as an early career researcher, it can be hard to tell which of those things you actually should do. And that's, again, where your mentors and your peers can be really helpful to say, I got asked to do this. Is this a good idea? And, someone senior will be able to tell you, like, do not do that. That is not a good use of your time. Or they might say, that's fantastic. It's an honor to be asked. But how to say no is probably one of the most important things that you can learn how to do. So I think taking risk is important, but always thinking about making calculated risks is more important.
So thank you, Kristen. So I suppose we'll move on then to our next slide is about seeking opportunities. Kristen, I believe you're going to talk to us a little bit about this.
So I think, we touched nicely already on the topic of opportunities, but it's a very kind of nebulous thing to say the word opportunities. What does that mean? I think when we think about opportunities, we're thinking about things that lead to those activities and the outputs that come with them. So opportunities might be the chance to take part in a panel like this, the chance even to attend a panel like this, where you might have another chance to network with someone. It might be awards, it might be committees with your local young cancer network or at the national level, might be publications. And really looking everywhere for those opportunities is really important. How did Amanda and I both end up at this Emerging Nurse Researcher Scholar Forum in Toronto is because we both sought that opportunity. We both saw that they were accepting applications and we both submitted one. Now, we might not have gotten selected if we didn't submit an application. And what I mean by that is that if you don't try for something, you'll definitely fail at it. Never try, you will always fail. So it's important to really think about opportunities, and sometimes it might take many times for you to apply to something to actually get it. And that's okay too. If you're applying for grants or awards, the feedback might be, you need to do a little more work in this area, you need to develop strength in this area. just go do it. Take that feedback and don't take it personally. Think about it as a gift to you to help you to develop. So when we talk about seeking opportunities, I think that the world is your oyster. It could be about local networks, but it could really be about developing global networks. And I think that's what's really exciting, is because your research interests that you have locally in Cyprus or in Ireland or in Canada might be the same as someone has who lives thousands of kilometers away from you. And you might have the exact same problem, and you could work on it together while also, gaining a friend and a network. So those opportunities, I think, can be really useful personally and professionally. Amanda, do you want to add?
I suppose I entirely agree with what Kristen has just been saying. And I suppose it's thinking of, don't dismiss small opportunities, because I suppose many of the grants that I've gone for are worth less than 500 or 600 euros, especially those travel grants where you can start to build your network. So I think it's, again, coming back to that idea of showing your upward trajectory, applying for small things, eventually they lead to bigger things, and it's all a cumulative mass. You grow and grow and grow. And again, it's kind of making those connections along the way, making sure you have fun and enjoy it as much as going to conferences, and networking is sort of part of work, but it's also a part of being social, meeting new people, identifying those potential connections, and kind of looking forward to opportunities for the future. You never know who you're talking to. And I suppose I always think of the people I've met along the way in my PhD, and everybody progresses in different directions, but you never know where someone will wind up, and the opportunities that there might be to collaborate that come about just because you know each other, you know of your mutual interest in that area. So it's making sure to foster those connections is a really good way to go forward. So Kristen, unless you have something to add here, I'll move on to our next slide. So I'm going to deal with sort of the negative of the seeking opportunities a little bit here. And it's, unfortunately, rejection is a natural part of a research career. And I suppose I look to some of the most successful academics that I know, and I know that many of them have a CV of failures that is far, far longer than their CV of successes. And I put it in context for me. Every job promotion or role change that I've had has taken a lot of planning. I've had several failed attempts. For every published paper I have, I've had at least 2 rejections, either at editorial stage or at reviewer stage. And for every successful grant I've had at least 8 to 9 rejections. And I suppose the big thing for me that I didn't realize until relatively recently, over the course of the last 7 years, I've applied for about 2.6 million euros in funding. I've managed to succeed in achieving 630,000 euros of that. So again, this comes back to your activity and outputs, and every grant you apply for is an activity. Even if it's not successful, it is an activity, and that is an output for you in developing your research career. You're developing skills, you're getting feedback. So every failure you have, you should see it as an opportunity. Don't take anything for granted. And while it might be disappointing, always see it, the opportunity for growth in failure and taking on this growth mindset. And I suppose if people want, this is my embarrassing rejection and failure story, but thinking about how critical feedback can be misconstrued and misinterpreted. I suppose starting out in my career, I would have been a very, very nervous presenter, and I think I still am, but I think I've managed to hide it better as years have gone on. But in my first presentations, when I'd get anxious, I would always speak faster. And as many of my EONS colleagues already know, I speak fast anyway. So speaking faster when I was nervous, even native English speakers would have difficulty understanding me. And I remember the very first presentation I did in a European setting in 2014, a friend of mine, she's now a friend, but she came up to me and she said, "Your slides are great, your project looks amazing, but I have no idea what you said, so I can't really tell." And that was extremely upsetting for me. This was a very vulnerable moment for myself. I put myself out there. and probably took a little while to adjust and overcome that. But I think what you have to realize is that sometimes when you get feedback, not many people are trained in how to give feedback and how to give it constructively. So the strategy I always take with failures and feedback and those rejections that you get is to open it or listen to it, skim through it, note the high points, and walk away from it for at least a week. Because when you're less emotional about it, you've had a chance to digest it, you're able to take a more pragmatic and critical look at what it is you're dealing with and take more practical approach to revising it and addressing the issues that have been raised. So Kristen, I don't know if you have anything you want to add here on failure and accepting it.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Amanda says and have experienced rejection as well, a lot of it. And I think really you have to develop a thick skin, but knowing coming in that rejection is part of it. It's not always rejection. Sometimes it means, again, rejection is redirection. Maybe you didn't submit your paper to the right journal. Maybe the grant that you wrote actually wasn't very good in the first place. So you need to work a little harder on it. And I find that with the feedback from grants and papers and feedback in person, it's really hard to take. And then once I go back to it, I find that it's usually true. So if you can get yourself into a place where you can accept that critical feedback and really think about the feedback that you're getting about a paper or a grant, it's actually not about you, it's about the paper. So that's something that's really important. When I write reviews for journals now, I really try to say this paper instead of the authors, right? Because it's just one paper. It doesn't make or break you. It's not the end of the world. Having said that, rejection can still really sting sometimes. And I think Amanda's second point here around finding people to commiserate with is really important. Not everyone is going to understand this. I think that my spouse still doesn't really get what I do. So I don't share with him a lot of the, the rejections and things he doesn't understand. But I have a lot of peers who really get it, and I can send them a text message or a message on Twitter, and they get it. They know what we're talking about. So I think cultivating a group of folks who you feel really comfortable with. And then in terms of thinking about where rejection fits in meeting your goals, I think that's what's really important. Think about where that rejection puts you on your path to meeting those goals. And if it's really a critical rejection, it might be important to talk to a senior mentor or a supervisor or someone who can really, help you to situate that failure within your journey. But failure is part of it. And so I think that's all I'll say about that. If there are more questions, please let us know in the chat.
I think a last thought from me on this that I hadn't said was someone a very long time ago said to me that it is a part of academia and you have to develop a lot of resilience in how you cope with it. And I think a lot of the tips Kristen has just given there are really helpful as well. But also conceptualize it as if you never fail, there's a good chance you're not aiming high enough. Someone who is entirely successful and never has had any failures is likely not challenging the boundaries of what they're capable of. So you have to try and think of it like that as well. You're setting a benchmark for yourself and where you'd like to go and where you'd like to be when you aim high. And I think that's something young cancer nurses might be guilty of, is kind of underestimating themselves and not giving value to what they're capable of. So if anyone takes anything away from this part of the talk, again, it comes back to taking a bet on yourself and putting yourself out there and being vulnerable. But again, identifying the strategies that you need to be resilient about the rejection that does inevitably come, and who to talk to and who you trust. So then, did you have something there, Kristen? No, sorry. So then the last point here is taking rest. And I think Kristen's going to talk to us about that.
Sure. I think this is probably the most important thing, is to find ways to escape from that sort of all-consuming research or academic work alongside clinical work if you're doing that as well. So whatever it is, playing a musical instrument, learning something new, cooking, if you have a family, I find, honestly, I have young children and they don't ask for my attention, they demand it. So it is really, my kids really make me go to the park. They make me get outside. I know people who have pets. That's also a way that, you know, you can really get into fresh air. But I think stepping away from the work that you're doing can actually be really helpful. We're not computers. We can't run continuously. We have to have a break. And sometimes your best thoughts and the best work that you do might come after you have a nice break. And I think Europeans do a lot better about taking vacation than North Americans do. But, you know, really taking that time to be away from work is important. No one's going to come to your funeral and say, oh, I remember that paper you wrote. It was so great. Or, you know, I remember that conference presentation. You know, at the end of the day, we have to live our lives, and our jobs can be very fulfilling and very important to us. But it is also really important to be realistic about the fact that these are jobs and these are goals. And alongside that, we need to think about the life that we're living as well. And living a long time is good too. Amanda, jump in. I'm rambling.
Jump in. I am afraid that I am not the person to advise on this because I have not learned the art of saying no yet. This is a skill that I'm developing, and I find it incredibly hard to say no to things. And I think particularly I started a new job in the middle of a pandemic. I haven't quite met colleagues. I haven't quite, I'm settled and settling in, and I really enjoy my job. But I think you can feel an immense pressure, particularly early in your career, to say yes to everything. So I think someone, Kristen, has just popped up, it's say no, don't say no, say not now, but also coming back to your strategic plan. When you're asked to do things, consider how it fits into your strategic plan. And, you know, is this something that is going to help you as much as it helps the other person? And I suppose something we haven't put in here, and it's related to this, is part of my philosophy as an early career researcher is very much paying forward what you get. And you get an immense amount of support, and your successes are ultimately the product of a village of support. It's not just the work you do, it's the support you get from your family, it's the support you get from your colleagues, it's the support you get from your mentors. And I suppose when I think of the successes I have, it's really important to me to pay forward all of that support and supporting the next generation of people who are coming behind and who want to follow this path, and trying to find ways to support them. And I suppose this webinar series is an example of that. So there's a balance to be had, but again, this is a skill I'm learning, and I'm kind of guilty of not being able to be the best source of advice on it. So maybe it's more do as I say, not as I do. So that brings us to the end of our formal presentation. So if there's any questions, we'd be delighted to answer them. And I think Constantina and Laura are going to lead on this.
So firstly, we would like to thank you for your tips and a few things that we will for sure use it to achieve our goals. Summarizing, I would like to repeat that if we don't try, we will not gain our goals. As you said, that we need to rest because we always forget to give to our self time to relax and escape, as Kristen said. But I would like to ask you something because I think it wasn't clear. If we have to ask something, Kristen, it wasn't clear. We don't have to ignore our mentors. I understood, but someone asked.
So the question is, should you ignore your mentors?
Yes, but it wasn't like you said only that we have to choose what we have to present and to who. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. And you know, Amanda and I have given another presentation before where we talk about having a mentor for every occasion. So a mentor might be a mentor at work. Maybe you have a mentor actually in EONS. Maybe you have a mentor at another university that you met at a conference. I have so many mentors. I consider Amanda a mentor to me. She offers me support and advice. So I think there are different mentors for different questions and different problems. For example, I have 3 kids, young kids, and there are certain of my mentors who would have said, absolutely do not have children. So when I was thinking about having kids, I didn't talk to them. I didn't talk to them about it. I talked to other mentors. And I think particularly if you do have a family or you want to have a family, it's really helpful to talk to other researchers and other academics who have been able to have a family alongside their career. That's not a goal for everyone, but a lot of the women I work with, I have 3 children, and a lot of the women I work with also have 3 children. Somehow, I don't know why, if I sought people, but you know, I think that it's not easy to be a parent and an academic, and so you seek people who are doing the same as you.
Okay. Do you think is there any magic recipe for the rejects? I mean, we have to change them, or we have to try again and again to achieve something, let's say for the publications or to get a job. What is your opinion, Amanda?
Now, the first part of that broke up on me. If you don't mind repeating just the first piece.
Okay. I mean, if we had a reject, do you think we have to try again or to skip it?
Absolutely. I think it's important. I think Kristen gave really good advice on this, is that they skim it, stepping back from it, and then going back at it with a more self-critical lens, being able to look practically at the feedback you've been given against the document or issue that you're being fed back on, but then taking that feedback to improve what you've presented and trying again. That is really, really important. I think there's never any lost work. Everything you start with can always be improved, and it's taking the feedback that's, because it takes time for someone to give you feedback. And I always think, particularly when feeding back to students, it's so important to take on board the feedback you're given and use it in the future, even if it's on a different project or a different paper, or, you know, being practical and kind of taking that on board.
Okay. As I can check on our messages, someone wrote that 10 times rejected. Okay. That's good.
I think it has been a really interesting and inspiring session because not only from young cancer nurses that want to have a research career, I think that it's for everyone that is on this career. You have set some really important tips to continue to advance in this career. But I think that perhaps sometimes when you are in a PhD or some master, you have some moments that you think, why I am doing this? I can't continue. Why I'm spending all this time doing this? So I don't know if you can say if you have suffered some of these moments that, okay, I don't want to continue, or what, I'm spending too much time on doing these things.
I can take that, and I can also tell you that that doesn't stop when you're done graduate school. It doesn't stop. I think any job is hard and has challenges, and you question, particularly in a job where there is so much rejection and critical feedback all the time. But one thing I think is interesting is if you, I have this conversation with doctoral students recently. If you look at a paper that you wrote, 10 years ago, whether you were an undergrad or, whenever that was, how much growth you've made, all of that feedback, it's huge. All of the feedback you're getting, we're changing and developing and learning every day. Nurses are so well positioned to succeed in academia because that is what we do in clinical practice. Patients come in with new things, new devices, there's new treatments, there's new medications. We have to learn how to deal with that. I think, and you know, just to address this sort of comment in the chat that came from Rachel, Rachel's question was about being newly qualified and how long you practiced. I practiced between when I graduated from my degree, that's entry to practice in Canada, and when I started my master's, and continued to practice throughout. But I think that there is, I know one of my trainees is on the call, and I know that they have had challenges explaining to people that they want to do their master's as a new grad, and feeling challenged and feeling like they are somehow saying that they're going to be better than the people who are on their unit. So the sort of kind of power dynamic, I think that exists, and I'm not quite sure what the solution is to that. Amanda might have a better idea, but really, you know, if you chose to go into public health or work in the ICU, it would be the same. You're still a nurse, you just have a different nursing practice. Your practice becomes research. So it's not about being better or being smarter, it's just about having a different interest, in my opinion. Amanda, do you have anything to add?
I think from my perspective, I entirely agree with what Rachel said. It does happen that you do encounter that hostility, but I think I am seeing change. And I suppose I've been in nursing now for just over 12 years, and I can certainly see a huge difference in sort of the perceptions of academic nursing and research in clinical environments compared to when I started nursing 12 years ago. So I think we have a hopeful future to look forward to. And I think the further along we go with nurses being educated at degree and master's level, the more we're going to see this improving and this perception changing. But I suppose Daisy actually asked, or was it Rachel that asked how you manage it? I suppose the thing for me is you have to respect that the person who might be holding those more negative views perhaps comes from a very specific perspective. They may not see the value of research, but you cannot overlook the fact that they have decades of experience, and experience is extremely valuable. So you have to, as a young nurse or an early career nurse who's interested in pursuing research, see the value of working together and marrying the two and asking that person for their insights based on their experience. And I suppose I can see, particularly I'm teaching student nurses now, and it's trying to kind of navigate that, what they're seeing in practice, what they believe to be true, and trying to get them to delve into, well, what does the literature say to support what you're seeing in practice? And it's trying to bring this into the environment. And I think you in the clinical environment who are interested in doing research, and those experienced clinicians who might not have had, because I think the important thing to remember is that they may not have had the opportunities to pursue master's and PhD. And I certainly see this in our young cancer nurses study here, that a lot of the animosity that we hear about actually comes from a lack of opportunity for those more senior generations. So it's about trying to find ways to work together, be collaborative, and recognize the value that both perspectives bring to the situation and how it can benefit the patient ultimately, because you have to remember that's ultimately why you're both there. You want best patient care possible. You want to optimize the services and their outcomes. So it's, again, coming together.
So, and for the end, I think we have a question. What advice do you have for student nurse? Let's say to follow the research or to leave it because of the time or because of the reject, or?
I'm happy to take that. I suppose it's really taking on board the advice we've given at the stage that you're at. I think looking for mentors, and your mentors might be newly qualified nurses, and that's certainly something we saw in our young cancer nurses study, is that nurses who are 1 and 2 years out from their degree working in the clinical setting are mentoring those young cancer nurses. So it's taking that opportunity. I think always ask questions, always be hungry, and always look for opportunities to learn and grow. That's really the only thing I can say.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that we have to finish because we are on time. Thank you for this inspiring and motivation session. It has been really good to hear from your experiences, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attend.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
We'll see you again next week.